Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. The Ukrainian delegation visiting Washington on Friday was forced to deal with an unexpected twist, as Trump seemed to be walking back on earlier suggestions concerning long-range weapons. The apparent shift came after a 2-hour-long call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, followed by news of upcoming Trump-Putin summit in Budapest. So, does this mean Ukraine's efforts are back to square one? Joining us now is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at University College Dublin. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So one comment that I've seen recently following that meeting in Washington was that instead of long-range weapons, we've got a long-range curveball thrown to President Zelensky. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't think it was a curveball because, in a sense, I think we saw Trump's pitch coming. We know that Donald Trump quite often listens to the last person in the room. And Vladimir Putin literally got into Trump's ear on Thursday. It's important to remember what Putin said to set up what happened on Friday. Putin got into Trump's ear in that call that he made and said, look, if you give Ukraine Tomahawks, it's going to damage our relations. You can't tell what kind of harm it will do to the U.S. and Russia, and it won't change anything on the battlefield. And by the way, his financial assistant, Kirill Dmitriev, said, let's have a Putin-Trump tunnel linking Russia and the U.S. state of Alaska through the Bering Strait. So they both flattered Trump, and they also talk about dire consequences if he agrees to the supply of Tomahawks. And on Friday, that scheduled meeting between Zelensky and Trump is only about an hour. It was a working lunch, was the way it was described. So there's a very small window for Zelensky to get his pitch in. In the end, it was about a 2-hour meeting. And as Zelensky said afterwards, yeah, look, we've got to be realistic here. Trump didn't agree to the Tomahawks going at this point to Ukraine, but he didn't say no either, because there's a wider context here. It's not just Trump you have to be thinking about, it's the Trump administration. And the Ukrainian delegation has been talking to senior members of that U.S. delegation all through the week. Zelensky's been talking to U.S. defense companies as well. And so he and the Europeans will, again, keep this encouragement of Trump going next week. They'll go back to him and they'll say, look, you want a settlement, you want a deal here. Vladimir Putin is not stopping. He continues to attack us. So what are you going to do when he, again, rejects your approach to get this great peace deal that you're seeking? In other words, you don't get Trump suddenly agreeing to the Tomahawks. You have to edge him towards it. And that means you have to get to certain Trump administration officials who favor that course of action.
So overall, the advantage of this is that the Tomahawk missiles have entered the conversation. They were not even in that conversation under the previous administration. They may be off the table for now. They could come back. What do you think Ukraine should do in the meantime? There was this pitch concerning drone technology, knowledge sharing experience with the American military. What else should Ukraine do at the present stage as we await that meeting in Budapest?
That's a great summary and a great question, because when you get the Tomahawks back in the conversation, all right, at least they're there. But in the meantime, look at what else came up this week in the United States. Zelensky and his officials would have been talking to those U.S. defense companies about air defenses. They will have been talking about drone technology. They will have been talking about weapons on the battlefield. Now, we know that one of the successes is that Ukraine and Europe have gotten the Trump administration to agree to the sale of U.S. military arms through NATO countries to Ukraine. You keep that going. You escalate that. You very importantly have assurances that some of that increased U.S. aid does include those air defenses, which are vitally needed over the winter as Russia continues to try to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And at the meantime, you talk about those joint initiatives, for example, in drone production. And while, of course, Ukraine would like the Tomahawks for those counterattacks inside Russia to hit Russia's facilities supporting the invasion. Their drones alone are causing significant damage to oil refineries, to gas pipelines, to railway hubs, to engineering firms, to chemical firms. So you just keep that pressure on Putin behind the front line. You maintain the front line where Russia can't get a breakthrough, and you play to get through the winter into next year when, once again, you might have this gradual shift with more American assistance, including the possibility of those Tomahawks.
So now, two questions, or perhaps one question combining two issues. What should Europe do in this case? Because the European Union was left a bit out of the loop with the meeting in Budapest. After all, we know the relations between Budapest and the European Union, not the warmest, right? But also, there is a question of whether Germany could step in and provide something of a consolation prize, Taurus missiles. Obviously, the range is 5 times less than that of a Tomahawk missile. Still, that would be a major technological advancement there. And another related question, can Europe do more to help Ukraine develop its own capabilities in terms of long-range missiles? I mean, Ukraine already has the Flamingo missile. Maybe it needs more production capabilities, some refinements to the guidance systems, for example. That could prove to be a formidable weapon against Russian refineries and military installations, right?
Right. I mean, we'll start with the Putin-Trump meeting if it comes off in Hungary. You just let that happen and you look for it possibly to go wrong. We know that Viktor Orban will thump his chest because in a way he's standing up to the EU because he's providing this support for Putin to have this meeting. But we know now from officials who've spoken to the media that the Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump didn't go well, that Trump wound up refusing to make any concession to come to the negotiations, and that he began to give Trump a long history lecture that upset the US president. Well, you look for the same thing to happen in Hungary, because the fundamental that Europe and Ukraine can play on is that Putin does not want to compromise, and that he keeps on overreaching with his attacks on Ukraine, which will upset Trump. Now, what does Europe do in the meantime? We have seen a significant advance from the EU and European countries. I mean, it's too slow at times. It's a bit cumbersome. But it is Europe that has stepped up to be that #1 supporter of Ukraine in military as well as financial assistance. You have individual states like the Germans, who I wish would stop waffling and being indecisive over Taurus missiles. I think in a way that the Biden administration was indecisive in the United States. The Merz government is still a little bit shaky regarding its own domestic opinion. I'm not sure they will come through with the Tauruses. So what does the EU and other members do as a whole? What do NATO members do as a whole? And that is they continue to provide those types of cooperation in technology and in equipment that you've referred to. It will not lead to a Russian defeat, but it continues to constrain the Russian economy as well as the Russian military. And I'll just put it to you this way. If you compare where we were at the start of this year, when the Trump administration walked away from Ukraine, when Europe was being slow in getting vital ammunition, getting vital artillery to the front line, let alone delivering support for air defenses, well, Ukraine is still standing, and Europe is much more in the game, as it were, 9 months later.
So now, if we have this situation here, let's take a look at the other side of the barricade, so to speak. Do you think that Russia really does have any options left? There was a recent article by Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden, and he said that at this stage, winning the war was not possible for Putin anymore. Does he realize this? And do you think that he will scale down his objectives and maybe accept this idea that Trump has floated, that, freeze it on the line of contact, let history decide and so on? Because this is what he said following the meeting with President Zelensky.
The Russian tactics just appear to be more of the same. I mean, on the front line, they just keep hoping for a collapse of Ukraine's defenses. We know that Ukraine is stretched in terms of its manpower, and that's a key thing. We know that Ukraine does not have the same amount of artillery, the same amount of frontline equipment that the Russians have. But we also know that despite that, the Russians have not been able to get the big breakthrough in Donetsk. They've, I think, captured 0.4 of 1% of Ukraine territory this year. They haven't even yet taken Pokrovsk in Donetsk, despite the fact they've now been attacking that logistics hub for about 16 months. We know that they're trying to go to other areas, that they tried to advance in Sumy. They did not really break through there. They're trying to get a breakthrough into Dnipropetrovsk, and so far they haven't gotten that. And that's just what they're going to keep doing. They're going to continue, as they have every winter since 2022, to try to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. They have crippled it. They have hindered it with those 6 set of attacks since the start of October. But Ukraine's still using imports, using support from others, is still holding together. And I don't expect a collapse on the energy front either. But Putin is like a shark. Putin's like a shark that's trying to get his prey. And if a shark ever stops swimming, he dies. And Putin does not know how to stand still and to accept what he already has. He has to try to get more. So I think Russia will keep trying to do this. I don't think they'll get that vital breakthrough. And you and I, a month, 2 months, 3 months later, will be talking about these same issues, which is with Russia unable to break through, when do we finally have that decisive support for Ukraine to almost break the ability of Putin to keep on swimming like that shark and to make him stop?
Speaking of which, do you think that the West still suffers from the issue of not really having a strategy towards Russia? I mean, this was pointed out a couple of years earlier, when the war was just starting. We don't really know what we want to achieve. Some countries would rather see the regime in Russia collapse slowly under the weight of sanctions, perhaps also these energy sector attacks. Others are more restrained. They are afraid that, if the Putin regime begins to collapse, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? Do you think that we're really still suffering from this issue? That we don't really know if we want this shark around, we want to contain it in a fishbowl, or do we want to get rid of that altogether?
Well, I think most countries in Europe, and I would talk about that not only individually, but under the umbrella of the EU, under the umbrella of NATO, and I think supporters in the international community. I talk about countries like Canada, Japan, Australia, who have provided support for Ukraine as well. I think they generally know that what they need to do is they need to draw up a firm defensive line against Russia, not only in Ukraine, but against Russia's hybrid warfare elsewhere. I mean, your viewers in Poland will know, in recent weeks, the intense discussions about, for example, countering those Russian drone and fighter jet incursions into airspace. You all will know about the need to counter Russia's cyber operations, the need to be able to deal with Russia's propaganda, its disinformation operations, and indeed its sabotage operations. So I think tactically, I think people know there has to be this coordinated effort.
Well, that's reactive still, right? That is reactive. And what about the end game?
Well, I think the end game is the same way, in a way, if I give you a comparison, that we faced during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And that is when, Poland had to endure that Soviet domination. The other countries in Europe had to make sure that the Soviets did not expand that zone. They did not break the will of other countries. It did not mean going in and overthrowing a Joseph Stalin or a Leonid Brezhnev, or that you simply weren't going to collapse the Soviet Union in that way with a military assault. At the end of the day, the Soviet Union collapsed out of its own economic burdens. Here, I think you have a similar situation with Russia. You're not going to break Russia. Vladimir Putin still is in control of the country. He still is in control of the propaganda machine.
But we have to wear it down. Right, we have to wear it down. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but still, thank you very much for your input today. Professor Scott Lucas was our guest here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.